Good. Huh? Hello, everyone. My name is Ole Jakob Sending. I'm very pleased to host this event organized by the Center for Geopolitics here at NUPI. And we are very pleased and honored to have Professor Akio Takahara from Tokyo Women's Christian University here with us to talk about the evolving linkages between Indo-Pacific and European security. I should say that the event today will be streamed. Following Professor Takahara's talk, we will have a conversation here on the stage with my two colleagues, Charlotte Børing and Erik Solli. And then after that conversation, we will open up, of course, for questions and comments from the audience. And with that, I think I will just leave the floor to you, Professor. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity to exchange views on the linkage between the Indo-Pacific security and the European security. It's a big topic, but I'll try to limit my talk to something like the aim is to speak less than 45 minutes, but let's see how it goes. I'm sure you have a lot of questions, and we'll have a good discussion later. Well, the key country in the linkages are, of course, China. China's military and economic rise. And I'm actually a China expert, so inevitably we'll be focusing a lot on China. But very quickly, I think there are two pillars or the two major linkages between the two security questions. Of course, the largest security threat in the Indo-Pacific is China's military rise, I'm afraid to say. Not only the increase in its military might, but also they've been acting, as I will explain to you a bit in detail later. And why is this linked to European security? Because, you know, the economies in East Asia are quite big. And if there is going to be disruption of sea lines of communication, Taiwan contingency, etc., there will be a big impact on the economies all over the world, including Europe, including Norway. So that's a very serious threat, potential threat to your security here in a certain way. And also, the largest security threat in Europe is, of course, Russia. Russia's aggression into Ukraine has had a huge impact on the East Asian scene too. Not only countries have started to worry about another Ukraine in East Asia. You know, we always worried about China's possible act over Taiwan, but especially since Putin's invasion 2 years ago, that started 2 years ago, we've been thinking about this question very, very seriously. So these are the two major linkages, and then you can see it very clearly that at the center of these there is China. So let me explain a little further about the Indo-Pacific scene. So as I said, our economies are big. So if we added all the GDPs of China, Japan, ROK, and Taiwan together, it adds up to about 1/4 of the total GDP in the world. And once a contingency arises there, if there is a Taiwan contingency, or in the South China Sea too, if the sea lines of communication are disrupted, immediately Lloyd's will stop providing insurances to shipping, and there'll be a major trouble in world trade, and that is going to send a tsunami all over the world, I must say. And also, another question is Russia, and you all know well, perhaps better than I, about China's support to Russia in its war efforts in Ukraine, provides a lot of dual-use technology, dual-use products, parts and materials, and they've been conducting joint military drills in Belarus. Why are they doing that? You know, and also the Chinese have gained greatly by importing cheaper energy products. And also the Russians are now willing to provide military technology more than before. So the European leaders have been calling on the Chinese leaders to stop exporting these dual-use products. Recently, I was in Berlin from mid-April to mid-July, and the big talk in Berlin, of course, was Scholz's visit, Chancellor Scholz's visit to China in April. And even from within his own cabinet, there were different voices coming out, but Scholz apparently tried to tell Xi Jinping that you should not export dual-use products. But then rumor has it that Xi Jinping retorted in a very mocking way, saying, well, then if I exported ice cream to Russia and if the soldiers ate that ice cream, is that dual-use product? I don't know whether it's true or not, but that's the rumor that's been going around. And when Macron and von der Leyen met Xi Jinping in France, the ice cream turned to rice, apparently. So if I exported rice. Anyhow, most recently, Mr. Stoltenberg said the same thing, but it hasn't had any impact so far, I'm afraid. I wonder what your Prime Minister told Xi Jinping when he met him a few days ago in Beijing. I'm very curious as to how the conversation went. Okay, and on the Japanese or the East Asian side, we are very, very angry at Putin's invasion. The identity of the Japanese is that we find ourselves a pacifist nation, especially after 1945. And we think the lesson that we learned the most is you should not impose your will on other nations by force or by the threat of force. And that's not only the lesson that the Japanese learned, but the humankind learned that extremely important lesson. That's why that's written clearly in the UN Charter. But now, a permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations, blatantly breaches this important principle and invades its neighbor. It's really frightening and threatening world peace. So as I mentioned to you earlier, there is a rising concern about the possibility of another invasion taking place in our part of the world. Now, there are a few very serious concerns in the Indo-Pacific. I can't go through all of them, but let me touch on a few. One is the Senkaku question. I'm not sure how familiar you are. I shouldn't bore you with too much detail, but the Senkaku Islands, that's now a big flashpoint, is here. The Japanese archipelago comes down very close to Taiwan, and mainland China are the Senkaku Islands. So what's the issue? The Chinese have been arguing since 1971 that Diaoyudao, the name in Chinese of the Senkaku Islands, Diaoyudao is ours from the Chinese point of view because they were stolen from Japan. They used to belong to the Qing dynasty, China at that time, but during the Japan-China or the Japan-Qing dynasty war in 1895, the Japanese stole the islands from them, and they are part of Taiwan. So when Japan lost the war in 1945, we returned Taiwan, which we colonized as a result of the 1895 war with the Qing dynasty. We returned Taiwan back to the Republic of China then. So Diaoyudao should have been returned to ROC, the Republic of China, at that time. That's how they argue. But the Japanese narrative is completely different. No. Senkaku Islands, we checked that nobody owned the Senkaku Islands in 1895. That's why we incorporated peacefully, without any protest, Senkaku Islands into Japanese territory. They became part of the Okinawa prefecture then. It's part of Okinawa, and therefore in 1945 there was no need. We didn't even discuss the Senkaku Islands because it was clear to everybody that they're part of Okinawa. Okay, and for the first time, China today, that's the People's Republic of China, started to claim that Diaoyidao are theirs in December 1971. But that's the first time that Japan ever got a protest from Beijing. Actually, Taiwan, the ROC government, started to claim sovereignty a few months earlier. But anyway, only in 1971, we started to receive protests. So all the maps printed in China before December 1971 have the name Senkakus, not Diaoyidao. Well, naturally, because that's how they used to see the situation. Okay, but then what's the problem? In 1972, we normalized our relations with China, and the Senkakus, of course, was a potentially big issue, right? Because how can you normalize relations when it's not clear where to draw the border? So that was a big headache. But then Prime Minister of China, by the name of Zhou Enlai, during Chairman Mao's days, told our Prime Minister, well, some people started to make fuss in China, some historians started to make a fuss because of oil. There was some research done a few years before this, and in the result of the research, they said potentially there's a big oil field in the seabed near the Senkakus. So because of that, some historians in China started to make a fuss. But do you think this is important? I don't think so. For him, what was most important, not the Senkaku or the Diaoyi, but to normalize relations with Japan and develop friendly relations with Japan. So let's not talk about it. That's what he said. And the Japanese Prime Minister was satisfied with that. So there was a tacit understanding. I don't know whether this is not Japanese foreign ministry policy, perhaps, but in my understanding as a scholar, there's a tacit understanding that neither side should touch on the issue. Always the islands had been administered by Japan. At one point of time, 200 Japanese used to live on the island, and even after they left, it was always administered by Japan, owned by private landlord, the islands. So the Japanese were happy that if the Chinese side is not going to touch on the issue, we won't make a fuss about that either. Okay? But you may know that recently we've been clashing very badly over the Senkakus. And from our point of view, the Chinese have been implementing a salami slicing tactics over the Senkakus. So first they started to mention the Senkakus, or in their language, Diaoyidao, in laws, and they started to send research vessels, etc. I'm not going to go into the details. Some so-called private sector activists, of course, there's the government behind them. They forcefully landed on the Senkakus and blah, blah, blah. There were so many issues. So from our point of view, China has changed, and China has become more assertive, or even more. So we have to respond to this real physical pressure that's being imposed upon us. So you may be familiar with this graph, I don't know, but this indicates the number of Chinese, mainly Coast Guard vessels that come into the territorial waters, that's in the red, and those that come into the contiguous zone just outside the territorial waters, that's in the blue. So you see a general trend, especially the number of boats coming into the contiguous zone is an increasing trend. But always when the Coast Guard vessels come, behind them are the naval vessels waiting. So it's this daily pressure that we feel from China that's increasing. And also, one of the problems that we have with China is the huge perception gap about what goes on between us. So when a trawler, Chinese trawler, collided with two Japanese Coast Guard vessels in 2010, this became a huge diplomatic issue between Japan and China. One day after the collision, the Xinhua news agency, the most authoritative Chinese media in China, dispatched this picture. This is what happened. So many, I think almost all the Chinese newspapers carry this picture, well, very neatly drawn by some artist, I should think, showing that huge two Japanese vessels hitting the belly, ramming into the belly of a small Chinese trawler. This is a version that the Chinese people got. So naturally, they'll get very angry about this. Yeah? But the Japanese version is this. This is from a leaked video taken by a Japanese Coast Guard official, showing very clearly that it was not the Japanese Coast Guard vessels that rammed into the fishing boat. I mean, by the way, the reason why the Japanese Coast Guard vessel was chasing the Chinese fishing trawler is because it was illegally fishing in the territorial waters around the Senkakus. We have a fishing treaty with the Chinese. They can actually come very close to the islands and fish, but the treaty does not cover the territorial waters. So whenever the Coast Guard vessels find the Chinese fishing trawler fishing there, they will chase them out. Usually that's it. But if the boat had been actually catching fish, the Coast Guard vessels will make them stop and make them give the fish back to the ocean. That's how it's treated. But this boat didn't stop, so the Coast Guard vessel chased. But then in the process of this chasing, they refused to stop and rather rammed into the Coast Guard vessel. And no damage was done to the fishing boat. But our Coast Guard vessels, although they're much bigger, they are damaged very badly. So it's a wonder how they could escape. I mean, eventually they were caught, but how the boat escaped from any damage, even though there was a collision. So it was done in a very professional way, in a sense. And this is September 2010. But 2 years later, this is what happened in reaction to the Japanese government buying these islands from a private landlord because why did this happen? Since at that time, one governor of the Tokyo metropolitan government by the name of Ishihara, who is a very conservative type of a person, he started to say that the central government is not doing enough to defend the islands. So I, the metropolitan government, will purchase the islands from this landlord. I will build a port. I will send a troop of policemen to defend the islands. And that's going to be a huge provocation to China. And the central government wanted to stop that. But the Japanese local system is such that they are, we don't call them local governments. We call them local autonomous entities. And the governors are elected directly by the people. So the prime minister of the central government has no right to order a local governor to act in this way or that. So the only way that the central government could stop this governor from purchasing the islands was to buy them instead. But then the Chinese reaction was very violent. And this is what happened in China. There were so many violent anti-Japanese demonstrations. There was arson, there was looting, what have you, beating Japanese, etc. This was 2012. So you understand that China is not very popular among the Japanese people these days. Okay, so what about Taiwan? Taiwan, I'm sure many people are interested in Taiwan. Also salami slicing from China happening here. On the left side, you see the blue here. This is where the Chinese PLA, People's Liberation Army, did their drills in 1995 and 1996. In 1996, there was the first democratic election of the president of the Republic of China. That's the Taiwan government. And then the Chinese wanted to intimidate the voters. So that's where they conducted their exercises. But when Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, it was the red areas where they shot their missiles too. Some missiles actually landed in the exclusive economic zone of Japan. Oh, we are very angry about that. So that's 2022. But in May 2024, the new president of the ROC was inaugurated. And these are the places that they conducted their exercises. There are a few islands very close to mainland China which are still administered by the ROC government in Taiwan. But there were exercises around there. And also, it's as if they were preparing for a blockade of Taiwan. It looked that way. So all these salam slicing are conducted. And about Taiwan, I think we should be aware of Xi Jinping's intentions about, all the targets, the goals of China's external policies. Internally, this is what he said from now, it's already 7 years ago, in 2017. He was speaking to naval officers, high-ranking naval officers internally. And he said that history indicates that a true world power is one that is both a sea power and a land power. It is our important strategic decision to proceed to a nation that is both a sea power and a land power. They have an identity as a land power. They also want to become a sea power too. But we are disadvantaged in the strategic geopolitical environment half contained by the first island chain. The route out to the outer ocean is seized by others. This is what he means. Some of you, I think, have seen this map before. If you look out into the Pacific Ocean from the Chinese side, the world looks like this. So the first island chain is this, the Japanese archipelago, there's Taiwan here, and the Philippines, Borneo, and it goes all around like that. That's the first island chain. And that's what he was talking about when he said that the route out to the outer ocean is seized by others. And he said, continued to say, to realize the China dream of rejuvenating the Chinese nation, we must head towards the ocean, which means, or which implies that, what are the aims that he wants to achieve by unifying with Taiwan? For decades, certainly, the Chinese Communist Party had this nationalistic goal to unite the nation, to unite the Chinese nation. Yeah? So the nationalistic aim still remains very strong to this day. But at the same time now, there could be another target, that is to win the strategic competition with the United States. They need Taiwan as a bridgehead, as a point of breakthrough to go out into the Pacific Ocean. So it raises our concern. Yeah? Okay, and nowadays the friction may be a too soft a word, but the clashes that's been happening with the Filipinos is very worrisome to many of us. So here once again it's salam slicing. Gradually, the Chinese are expanding their control in the South China Sea. And the most recent case is the escalation of their acts around the Second Thomas Shoal and the Sabina Shoal. And we are much concerned that there will be further escalation. So the Americans are very worried about this too. So if you have any questions, I can answer them. But let me quickly move on to the European scene and China's links with that. One day after the invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022, on the 25th, Putin and Xi Jinping had the second conversation in that month. Earlier, on the 4th of February, Putin visited Beijing. Do you remember why that was the case? Because it was they had the opening ceremony of the Beijing Winter Olympic Games. Yeah? And now, one day after the invasion, according to the Chinese, this is what Xi Jinping said: China has long held the basic position of respecting all countries' sovereignty and territorial integrity and abiding by the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. It looks as if Xi Jinping was opposing what Putin did. Yeah? But according to the Kremlin, that's what Xi Jinping said. Xi Jinping stressed that he respected the actions of the Russian leadership in the current crisis. And we all know by what they've been doing, how they have been cooperating with Putin in the last 2 years and a half. So it's true that those were the words by Xi Jinping. Yeah? And this position was underlined when then number 3 person of the Chinese Communist Party, by a man by the name of Li Jiangshu, he visited Moscow 2 years ago. And he told his counterpart, Li Jiangshu used to be the chairperson of the National People's Congress. So his counterpart was the leaders of the Duma, the parliament of the Russian Federal Republic. Yeah? So if you go to the website of the Russian Federal Parliament, you can see these words. Li Jiangshu said, China understands and supports Russia on issues that represent its vital interest, in particular on the situation in Ukraine. Then he continued to say, we see that the United States and its NATO allies are expanding their presence near the Russian border, seriously threatening national security and the lives of Russian citizens. We fully understand the necessity of all the measures taken by Russia aimed at protecting its key interests. We are providing our assistance. And the word he used in Chinese is 策应. 策应 in Japanese, sakuo, is a military term. It's a military term used when one force is supporting its friends on the battlefield. So I'm not too sure why he used this term. Some Chinese are angry that he used this term. So maybe the actual support on the battlefield is not given. But anyhow, that's the sentiment that he presented to the Russian side. The Russian side was very happy. So these written in big font size words if you go to the website of the Duma. Okay? Then why is Xi Jinping supporting Russia? Very clear, very easy to understand in a way. As I told you, for Xi Jinping, the most important external policy target is to win the strategic competition with the United States. And in order to win this competition, China needs Russia. It was very interesting last year when one member of the Chinese government told a group of Japanese that, are you familiar with the classic Chinese novel called The Romance of the Three Kingdoms? It's about 3 kingdoms that existed in 3rd century China. China was not united then. There were 3 kingdoms vying for hegemony. And there was the biggest country called Wei, which eventually united China. But there were 2 other smaller kingdoms. One is called Shu, and the other is Wu. In Japanese, it's Gi, Shoku, and Go. So his metaphor was that, telling us, oh, you Japanese love the romance of the kingdoms, right? So you understand, between Shu and Wu, the 2 smaller kingdoms, there are contradictions. Yeah, there are contradictions, but they need each other. You understand? Yeah, we can understand. So in order for China and Russia to compete with the United States, although they have contradictions between them, they still need each other. So that was the explanation given to us, very convincing. And the worldviews of the 2 leaders seem to be very similar. Yeah. My Russian friend, wrote about the worldview of Putin and the very few number of people surrounding him making policy decisions, telling us that their worldview is like this. The democracies give too much rights to refugees, LGBTQ, what have you. So this leads to internal divisions, and the democracies are failing. And as a result, the US-led international order is going through a crisis, and it's countries like China and Russia with traditional values that is going to lead the formation of a new world order. When I read this, this is very similar to Xi Jinping's view of the world. So according to my Chinese friends, Putin and Xi Jinping are soulmates, apparently. And I call it the Russification of Chinese diplomacy. That is, whatever happens in the world, China sees that phenomenon through the lens of its competition with the United States. I think Russia's been like that for many years, but now China is catching up, as it were. So in my view, China's external policy line currently can be described as having one center and 4 basic points, as it were. It's a Chinese-style expression. One center is to win the strategic competition with the United States. So the 4 basic points, or the 4 pillars, to support this major theme, the one center. First, ironically, it is to stabilize the relationship with the United States, because China understands that there is still a big gap in the national, comprehensive national powers of the 2 countries. And therefore, China needs the space, the room to develop. To develop, it prefers a stable relationship with the sole superpower. Not only in the international context, but also that is very important for domestic stability. So the Chinese friends tell me, actually, a stable relationship with the United States is the basis of the stability of everything in China. So that's the first basic point. And second, as I told you, to develop cooperation with Russia. And third is to cooperate with Europe and Japan and try its best, China's best, to make them more independent of the United States. So I learned that the Norwegian Prime Minister mentioned something like, we are different from the United States in the EV policy or whatever. Those are the kinds of remarks that make Chinese people very happy, or the Chinese government very, very happy. Their aim is to increase the independence, enhance the level of independence, especially the strategic independence of Europe and Japan from the United States. Of course, it's difficult. We have NATO, we have our alliance with the United States, but they will keep on trying. And the third point is, the last point, the fourth point is to cultivate ties with the so-called Global South. The Chinese have been good at this. Most recently in Beijing, they held what they call FOCAC, the Forum on Cooperation of Africa and China. And I think about 50 heads of state visited Beijing. So they do that very well, especially in these days. I've been traveling a lot of developing countries. I was director of the Research Institute of JICA, Japan International Cooperation Agency. We started the project on comparing smaller countries' bilateral relations with China. So I had the chance to visit Bangladesh, Thailand, Zambia, and got this strong impression that many countries in the developing world are not happy about the current world order. Especially they are now tired of being told to do this or that, to be lectured about human rights or democracy or whatever. So we should be aware of that sentiment. I think we should promote democracy and human rights to other countries, but we have to do it in an effective way. We have to do it in a way that would respect their dignity. They feel that their dignity has been hurt by the lecturing by us. So there's something that we should think about. I have a couple more slides, three more slides. Okay, then what to do with China? How should we deal with China? This is the big question. Okay, I have said many critiques about China, but it's not easy, is it? Because China is very important to all of us in many ways, especially to Japan. We are a neighbor, so we have to coexist with this big country that is now causing a lot of trouble to us. So I think, objectively, judging what we've been actually doing, at least in the past 15 years or so, especially since the Trawler collision incident, that really woke us up. China can be a big threat to us. We have had to compete reluctantly, but there's no choice. We have to stand up against their physical challenges. So we've been reinforcing our alliance networks. We've been helping our neighbors, capacity building, and we have started to increase our defense budget in a big way. Yeah, But we also cooperate with China because it's necessary for us. More investment, more trade. In fact, last year, the trade amount came down a bit. But anyhow, China remains to be our largest trading partner. And we do collaborate with them in non-traditional security areas, anti-piracy operations off the coast of Somalia, or when COVID happens, or environmental issues. There's a lot of cooperation going on every day with the Chinese. So that's very precious, of course. We have agreed to study the promotion of free trade. The trilateral summit meeting between Japan, the ROK, and China took place in May, and that was one thing that the Chinese wanted, and we didn't refuse. We will discuss that. And in my view, the Free and Open Indo-Pacific, FOIP, what we call FOIP, is our initiative to link the two oceans, the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean. That is to say, to link Asia and Africa, which we find the potential growth areas of the world. We find these areas very important. So we want rule of law to prevail in this region. We want safe and free and law-abiding order in the Indo-Pacific. And the Chinese, as you know, have their own Belt and Road Initiative. Yeah? And I've been arguing that these two can coexist, meaning both have two aspects. One is the strategic aspect. There's no question, there's competition there. But on the other hand, there's the economic cooperation side of things. So if you visit the website of the Japanese Foreign Ministry, look for FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific, you find a lot of ideas about enhancing rule of law or cooperation, economic cooperation, how we can provide, bring about more prosperity and safety and security in the region. So the Japanese are putting the cooperation aspect to the fore, while the United States have found this idea, free and open Indo-Pacific. That's good. So they've taken it up, but they have been emphasizing the strategic side of things. So it's interesting, whenever China criticizes the free and open Indo-Pacific, they always criticize the American free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. So they've never openly criticized the Japanese version of FOIP. And in fact, there are projects that are going on, joint projects between Japan and China. My favorite example is last November, the Mitsubishi Heavy Industry, who also produces a lot of arms, they, together with the Chinese 7th chemical construction firm, completed a state-of-the-art chemical fertilizer factory in Bangladesh. So these examples are beginning to emerge. So we should cooperate where we can. But the Chinese salami slicing or their advancement is not going to stop, right? So we get a lot of mixed signals from China. And this task of maintaining peace is a real one. And it's not easy, I find, as a China expert, I must say. So from our point of view, I think, I'm not an IR expert. I'm really an area studies person, so I tend to be realistic. We have to mobilize every means to maintain peace. So we should resort to realism, balance of power, very important. The Chinese Communist Party, they are believers in power and money. So we have to try and balance our power. Also, economic interdependence, it alone cannot bring about peace, but it still helps. So liberalism is also something we should mobilize, and also constructivism, sharing norms and values, especially the basic value of peace. We have to emphasize to the Chinese, come on, wake up, peace is so important to all of us. So that's how I feel. But it's a big challenge to maintain this two-pronged approach because it's contradictory, yeah? If you are security experts, you might say, oh, come on, stop cooperating. You know, if we cooperated, we're only making the other side much stronger. So stop. But if you are a business person or an economist, you would counter-argue by saying, what are you talking about? If we stop cooperation, do you think we can still compete with China if we lost this economic foundation that we have? Which side is correct? Both sides are correct. Yeah? So this is the dilemma that we are living in. This is the contradiction that we are living with. So we need the resilience and wisdom to live with this contradiction. But it's going to be very difficult since we, I think, all know that competition is going to intensify, right? We can't avoid that. But on the other hand, in certain areas, perhaps not in high-tech and semiconductors, but in many areas, cooperation is going to widen and broaden. Yeah? So it's going to be increasingly difficult to walk the middle way. In any country, the leader has to have a very broad power base to persuade both the hawks and the doves, as it were, and go the middle way. That's not going to be easy, but that's what we should try. And then the final question is, for how long must we persevere and what I call the strategic and uphold the strategic patience with this? I think we have to persevere until China changes. But this will incite a big question, yes? Will China change? Nowadays, many people in the United States, for example, think China's not going to change. Look at Xi Jinping, how backwards or how reactionary he is. That's true. But I, as a China expert, I think I would say like this. Hasn't China changed in the past 40 years? Haven't the Chinese people changed in the past 40 years? They have changed tremendously, and we see it every day. The Chinese people are changing. Maybe if you talk to any Chinese youngster who will come to Norway to study, you'll find that he or she just think just like us. But Xi Jinping knows this, so now he's trying very hard to win this competition, as it were. He's trying to indoctrinate, he's trying to educate the youngsters in his own way. But this is a competition, and I think we have to help the Chinese people change. So there are merits and demerits, but I think it's better to have more Chinese students come over to our countries and have more contact with the ordinary Chinese people, especially the young people. I think that's what we have to do. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. We'll now, if you can join me on stage and bring out the chairs, please. I'll just wait for that to go up and then. There, thank you. Thank you so much, Professor, for that talk. I wanted to start by giving my colleagues Erik and Charlotte a chance to offer some immediate reactions and reflections on your talk, maybe starting with you, Charlotte, and then Erik.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for that delightful seminar. It was very interesting topics. I think it's very important for Europe right now. We're having these conversations about how we react to China, how we perceive China as a threat, and these conversations are happening in different communities. I wanted to reflect a bit on what you mentioned about competition and cooperation, and how this consensus is growing in Europe on what areas do we cooperate with China on, and what opportunities are there for us to bring back our values and maintain the rule of law, maintain democratic principles. And so for Norway, you mentioned the recent visit from Prime Minister Støre to China, where I think for more and more countries in Europe, climate has been an area of cooperation where we realize that we need China. And the green transition of course, cannot happen with China with the high dependency a lot of European countries have on critical minerals, have on Chinese technology. So this idea that we will decouple is no longer really in center anymore. And then we also have to talk about, you mentioned FOIP and the BRI. So the BRI is a very sensitive topic when we talk about China and threat perception. How can FOIP and BRI coexist when it is so vastly different, the values they bring and the values they perceive? So the BRI and how it relates to debt sustainability for these countries that do receive a lot of Chinese aid and a lot of Chinese infrastructure being built in these countries that do not have a realistic alternative. What does that leave China with the room of possibility for how it can use this power are my main reflections.
Erik as well, and then you can have a chance to respond maybe. Yeah, Erik, please.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. It was very interesting and in many ways. What struck me was that in a geopolitical sense, your strategy is similar to Norway's, because you have to coexist with China, and we have to coexist with Russia. And what you called a dual-prong approach is very similar to what we call dual policy towards Russia, which has both similar elements as you elaborated on the competition and cooperation. However, the difference is that Norway and Russia, we're not economically dependent on Russia. We don't need a Russian market. We don't need Russian resources. If Russia is a gas station with a lot of nuclear weapons, Norway is also a gas station without nuclear weapons. So your dilemma is quite different, because you have this military aspect of it that you need to deter, and you need to build up a strong defense together with other partners and allies. In one sense, to set clear boundaries on what you do. That's similar, and also your approach to having a rule-based order. We have a similar strategy, because it's very important for Norway also to have a rule-based order, for instance, in maritime domain, especially in the Barents Sea. But the difference that you face, that you cannot, you have to have an economic relationship, a trade relationship with China. That's important for both parties, I assume. And that's something that's not in the equation we have in our part of the world. Also what I'd like to hear more from you later is how your assessment regarding in the deter and defense realm, how Europe plays in together with USA, Canada, and other Pacific nations like Australia, for instance.
Well, thank you very much for great comments. First on BRI and FOIP, how they can coexist. The first thing I would say is, what is the BRI? No one has defined it very clearly in China. And I liken the BRI concept to a constellation in the sky. Have you ever seen a constellation? I don't think so, because constellations don't exist, right? They only exist as an image in your brain. So what's real up in the sky are the stars, the projects. The projects are real. So Xi Jinping is pointing to a lot of the projects, in the region, and saying, look, you see a dragon there. That's the Belt and Road Initiative. And we all go, wow. But we should never be mesmerized by the concept. What's important to us all, including the recipient nations, and actually for the Chinese taxpayers, is the quality of the project. And I think that was behind what former Prime Minister Abe said in 2017, that Japan is ready to cooperate with the Belt and Road Initiative if the project met certain conditions. And the conditions he raised were openness of the project, transparency of the project, the economic viability of the project, and the fiscal soundness of the recipient nation being assured. If we make judgments about each project on certain points like those, I think there's a lot of room for us to cooperate. Actually, I mentioned the study that we've been doing comparing bilateral relations of smaller nations to China. If you could read some of the articles free, it's open access. The Journal of Contemporary East Asia Studies, that's the name of the journal, if I may repeat, Journal of Contemporary East Asia Studies, you'll find that there are many Chinese projects in the smaller countries, but what's important is accountability, transparency, and it's also the responsibility of the recipient nation to be transparent in their governance, to be accountable in their governance, and that's most important in implementing good quality projects. So we should support the developing countries in enhancing their governance capabilities, especially in terms of accountability and transparency. That's be my answer to you. And second, Europe is very important in the security front in the Indo-Pacific because we have to think of ways to deter China from making any adventurous moves. Yes, and as I mentioned, Xi Jinping Communist Party believes in power. So the presence of the European fleets, most recently Italy, the Italians came, the Germans came, and the French came. All the presence counts, I think, to increase the European presence in the Indo-Pacific theater in itself, I think, is very helpful in maintaining peace in the region.
I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on Charlotte's question that turns on this balancing between competition and cooperation. So this is so if you view that as a theory of how to do foreign policy, so you do both. You try to reduce the risk of something bad happening by having extensive economic cooperation, but then you also competing and you're aware of the dangers of that. Fine. We've tried that for many decades now with the idea that free trade would integrate economically. Now, how that will play out in the relationship between Japan and China seems to me to depend a little bit on, for example, business constituencies within China and how much sway or influence they may have on political decisions by the leadership. So if you could reflect a little bit on that, that would be interesting.
Well, as far as the Chinese businesses are concerned, they don't have much political clout within China, so we really can't expect very much about that. But I think what development or the enhancement of the living standards in China can do is to increase their awareness about the importance of peace, peaceful international environment in promoting their prosperity. And what's happening now is actually, we all know that the Chinese economy is in a very bad state, and many people are losing faith in the regime and in the leader, and therefore a lot of the Chinese are emigrating out of the country. Many are coming to Japan with money, with their families. Interesting that these things happen because we have a lot of cooperation. They understand Japan, so we have been one of the targets for them to emigrate. So it works in many different ways, but on your point, I don't think we can expect very much that the business circle will play some role in politics.
Could you say a little bit more about the state of the Chinese economy now? Because depending on what figures you look at, it looks okay or not so good. So what's your take on the health, as it were, of the Chinese economy right now?
There are many serious issues in the Chinese economy. We know about the very weak consumption. People had expected that when they ended the zero COVID policy, people would start consuming in a big way. But because, as I mentioned, people's trust in the future of China, people's trust in the regime of China has not recovered, or it's going down even further. Private sector is not investing in China. People are not increasing consumption. That's the reality. And leadership is desperate to find a new engine of growth, not real estate development. They can't rely on that
So from
anymore.
investment to consumption, basically, right?
Yes, they're trying. And in terms of production, they have to find a new engine also. And they can't find one. And this is not new, in fact. Even before COVID in 2019, the leadership had already been aware of these very fundamental questions or issues. So they were more open than now about the difficulties they were facing. And COVID came, so it was a very serious challenge to the leadership because they know they lack the legitimacy to rule. They are not elected by the people, so they have to keep on producing these results, real results in enhancing people's living standards. But they couldn't do that. At one point of time, because they thought they were successful in containing COVID, which the North Americans and the Europeans, the Japanese were not doing so well, they succeeded in raising the authority. People started to think that, maybe our system is much better than democracies. But in fact, it's not a matter of political systems. Democracies like Australia or Taiwan were dealing with COVID very well. But anyway, that's the kind of thinking that many Chinese people started to have. But then Omicron beat zero COVID policy, yes? And we don't know how many people died because of the sudden cancellation.
Yeah.
One estimate has it that 1.9 million people died in 2 months from December 2022 to January 2023. But when I tell these figures to my Chinese friends, they shake their head and say, perhaps there are many more than that. So people's trust, if we look back the history of China in the future, maybe we'll find 2022 as a big turning point. And people are, in a word of my friend, a Chinese friend, we are not disappointed with Chinese economy anymore. We only have despair. But of course, this is only an impression of one person. But it's shared by many. And as you hinted, things could change, and if the economy does recover, starts recovering, then the social atmosphere could change. But in China, anything could happen.
Yeah. So, no, that's fine. That's why you're here. In Europe, there are, as you know, and also in the US, a lot of talk about de-risking, and de-risking in particular from China. And I wanted to challenge you, Charlotte, because I know you have looked into this because there are lots of debates in Europe about, well, how does one really operationalize a de-risking framework? And you have looked at how that has been done in Japan over the last almost decade, I think. So could you tell us a little bit about how that looks? Because it has implications, I think, for the debates we have now in Europe.
Yes, so we've been writing this report, and it actually starts with what you were talking about, the Senkakus. So what happened around 2010 was the Senkaku incident. China imposed an unofficial embargo, which they called unofficial because then it would actually be a sanction against Japan. That led to Japanese supply chain disruptions. In addition to the 2011 triple disaster of the earthquake and tsunami, it very gradually reduced the supply chain indispensability Japan had. After that, METI induced these subsidies of Japanese businesses in China moving and graduating towards ASEAN countries to reduce these supply chain disruptions and build a resilient supply chain. Now, after 2020, the US began its IPEF economic integration into the Asian economy, basically. And IPEF also recently has this supply chain resilience pillar. Japan is also working with this economic security concept, which is what is the division between European debates is, are we talking about de-risking and decoupling, or are we talking about economic security in the sense that we have securitized economic relations in the manner of it? So in Europe, these discussions are wide, they're broad, they're very domestically contextualized. For Norway, this is happening in all levels of government. It's happening in situations where we don't know whether China is a security threat in itself. For example, Norway has, in 2010, when we gave the Nobel Peace Prize to Liu Xiaobo, we were also sanctioned against China. We have a relationship with China that is very tense. We normalized relations in 2017. Other European countries have similar experiences. Lithuania has experience with Chinese economic coercion. And a lot of these discussions about economic security has a new meaning. So Japan is also related to this concept of economic security since the 1980s, but then in the sense of health security, food security, agriculture. Now we're talking about security and economy as so integrated that you cannot have defense cooperation and economic cooperation without this being based on mutual values. Report has been looking at.
What is the thinking from a Japanese perspective of this focus on economic security? Because it certainly, in light of your focus on cooperation and competition, it's an interesting, balancing act, I guess.
We are all in agony, as it were, because it's so difficult to find the right path about these questions. Very delicate, and so diversification certainly is so important. You can't put all the eggs in one basket. But for a long time, the Chinese market had been so lucrative that for certain companies it's been very difficult to pull out and go somewhere else and have a second or third factory in other countries. But increasingly this has been happening, the China Plus One strategy. We've been talking about it for at least 20 years, I think. So those companies who are able to implement this strategy have been doing that. So a lot has been to Vietnam, even before the Japanese government started to provide some support to do those things. That's one thing. But there are still many companies who have high hopes on the growth of the Chinese market. You name it, Panasonic or Hitachi or even some automobile companies too. Although Mitsubishi Motor has pulled out because of the very severe competition that they have to go through. But some companies are ready to think in a way that if you cannot win in China, the Chinese market, you won't succeed elsewhere. So the picture is very mixed. It depends on the industry, it could depend on the company. So it's hard to draw a very clear picture. That's how I feel.
On the military and defense side, Per-Erik, there's been a lot of increased activity and cooperation between European states and Japan. Can you say a little bit about how you view those developments?
If you look at the European footprint in the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific area, it has increased substantially since 2021. But it's not directed bilaterally necessarily towards Japan, but toward a regional aspect, towards Australia, for instance, and other countries. So if you look at the exercise arenas that the European countries have participated in, they are usually involve Japan and other Asia-Pacific states, and also, of course, Canada and the United States. This year, I think there have been more than a dozen European naval vessels participating in exercises in the Indo-Pacific area, and actually more than 50 military aircraft participating in various exercises. From a slow start in 2021, even if Europe has been supporting the Ukraine in its war against Russia, there's been two parallel processes. One is the supporting Ukraine process, but the other one is actually increasing the involvement in the Asia-Pacific area. And that's grown steadily also after 2022. And next year, the plans are even more ambitious than before. And the reason why European navies, air forces, and militaries get involved in the Pacific area is threefolded. The first one is, of course, that we all do understand, as you elaborate on in your presentation, that any disruptions in the South China Sea, East China Sea, the Taiwan scenario, that will, of course, have impact on global and regional trade, but also the world economy, definitely. So it's all in our common interest to have stabilized the situation in that part of the world. The second, of course, is USA. Europe is dependent on America in many ways to deter and defend ourselves in our own backyard. But the Indo-Pacific is the most important arena for the United States. So if we support them in an area that's most important to them, of course, that will help us out of maintaining American involvement also in Europe. And the third is also defense industry. If we look at just as Russia has sparked the unity and also increased defense budgets in Europe, China has done the same thing. China has their coercive behavior, their aggressive behavior, has also resulted in increase in defense budgets in Asian and Pacific states. European defense industries, also the Norwegian defense industry, is now far more heavily involved to sell their goods in that part of the world. It's, of course, a market aspect, but also a lot of the products that are made in that part of the world is also very interesting for us. In Norway, we have purchased artillery from South Korea. We also, the supply ship of our Navy is also purchased from a wharf in South Korea. So a lot of technology is being developed by Japan and others is very interesting for us, when we also increase our defense budget and need modern capabilities.
Do you want to comment on that, or should we move to...
One quick point is, Japan, because of the constitutional limits, we haven't been able to export military products in a big way. But slowly we've been changing our policies. And if China does something even more stupid, I think the changes will be bigger.
Okay, let's open up for questions and comments from the audience. We have a microphone, so please use that. Malin has that. Please identify yourselves and be fairly brief. Starting here.
Thank you. My name is Christopher Ronneberg. I'm a journalist at Aftenposten newspaper in Norway. Thank you very much for the talk and for the discussion. I just wanted to build on the last point here that you've also touched upon before, this increased presence of European naval ships in the Indo-Pacific area, and also what seems to me to be one of Joe Biden's most important foreign policy tasks, building up the alliances with AUKUS, with the Squad. How much of this do we see going the other way? Is there the solidarity with Europe when it comes to the Ukraine war, for example? How big is the interest in to take Japan as maybe the best example in providing aid to Ukraine so that we can deal with our situation here and maybe then be better able to help our allies in East Asia? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. As I told you, we were shocked and angered by Putin's invasion. We feel we cannot tolerate it, and therefore we've been supporting Ukraine in a big way. Not only financially, we have Ukrainians, I think you do too, but come over to Japan and join our companies and universities and things. And also we are looking at the reconstruction of the country after the hostilities will be stabilized. And as I told you, I also belong to JICA, and our president has already visited Ukraine, and he has appointed a very capable person in charge of the reconstruction of Ukraine. So I don't have the figures in my head how much we've been contributing in terms of US dollars, but still I can assure you that the contribution has been large, and we find the Ukrainian situation extremely important.
Other questions or comments?
Hi, I'm Sten Tulsjø. I'm a professor at the Norwegian Defence University College. I just wanted to pick up on sort of you pointing to the challenges China is facing with its economy. And you also mentioned that historically China over the last decades have changed. The Chinese people have changed. But to me, their overall aim of being the dominant power in their own region is still very much a strong sentiment among Chinese. Take the Taiwan issue, for instance. I don't think their view on the Taiwan sovereignty has changed very much over the last few decades. Do you think if China has this headwind when it comes to the economy, do you think their sort of more assertive behavior will be stronger or weaker depending on
Yes, that's a good
how
question.
their economy develops?
Yes. I think China's intentions have grown, you know. Zhou Enlai, the prime minister serving Chairman Mao in 1973 or 4, met a delegation of young American scholars visiting Beijing, and he asked a young member of the delegation, actually her name is Jan Beris, but anyway, he asked her, do you think China will ever become hegemonistic? And being a person who would visit China even before normalization of relations, she was a very pro-China person at that time. So she answered, no, sir, I don't think China will ever become hegemonistic. And Zhou Enlai answered by saying, you can't count on that. But if China becomes hegemonistic in the future, you have to oppose that and tell the Chinese people that you were told to oppose that by Zhou Enlai. But I don't think he was joking. Xi Jinping used to tell President Biden that the Pacific is wide enough for both America and China to coexist. Pacific was big enough to accommodate these two big powers. But we heard last November Xi Jinping telling President Biden that the globe is big enough. So, with the increase in power, even, people or political parties or countries, their intentions change. So, yes, as I told you, Xi Jinping's aim now is to become a true world power. And that's not going to change for some time. But, China is in the midst of modernization. And when a country is in the midst of modernization, you become fixated with this paradigm of enriching the nation, strengthening the military, just like Japan until 1945. That was our paradigm. So in the future, if China grows into a kind of a postmodern society where values such as small is beautiful can prevail, then things will change. But it's going to take a long time, I think. So that's why I was trying to say that for some time, perhaps a long time, we have to persevere and maintain peace.
I have... Oh, yeah, sorry. Then, and then there, and there.
Catherine Lagerberg, Crown Defense. I wanted to just ask you, because currently in Norway there are discussions ongoing with regards to, for example, electrical vehicles being heavily subsidized, produced in China, obviously out competing Western brands. And I wanted to ask you about this Japanese stance on this, and in addition, how does the Japanese government evaluate which companies and industries who get support when they need to de-risk, decouple, and not engage in contract and sales with China, obviously because of national security reasons? Thanks.
Thank you. As for EVs, I don't think we have an official policy about the importing of Chinese EVs, but what can I say? One reason is because EVs are not popular in Japan. We think the hybrid cars are good enough at the moment. If we can have renewable energy in a bigger way, perhaps it's different. And if we can think of how to dispose these used batteries and things, but at the moment we think it's too early to go for EVs in a big way. But as for economic security questions and subsidies, big subsidies go to semiconductors. Yeah, so that's one industry that we lost. We used to be the leading country in producing semiconductors, but for reasons that I don't quite understand, we fell behind, and now the government is trying so hard to revitalize that industry. But I'm not too sure whether we can succeed or not, to be honest. Industrial policy is a very debatable topic, isn't it? Whether it's good or not, actually. Some scholars, Americans, used to praise Japanese industrial policy, but there are other views in Japan that those subsidies didn't really help. But it was the entrepreneurial initiatives in the private sector that developed Japanese industry. So I'm sorry, I'm an amateur, so I can't give you an answer about that. Maybe Charlotte can.
Yeah, I can add about the evaluation part. So Japan was the first country to implement an Economic Security Protection Act in 2022, of which they identified 20 critical industries, like cloud computing, auto vehicles, critical minerals. And the actual implementation of this for companies is also streamlined through agencies such as JETRO, JOGMEC. On-site businesses get, the small and medium businesses, but also large enterprises such as Sumitomo, they get input from JOGMEC and JETRO in what risks are there, but the final decision is up to the company itself. So the issue with this is how much do you organize from the bureaucratic side of how interfering should bureaucratic systems be, but how much room do you let these companies invest? So they have the Economic Security Protection Act. They also have an Economic Security Minister, which is meant to coordinate these activities. There are also, and there have been for a long time, regarding industrial policy, meetings between private business and government that happens every year. So industrial policy is a sensitive topic. Economic security is still developing, and combining these two is the issue for Japan right now.
Okay, I have there, and then, yep. So maybe we group these, so Jakob and Cedric, you have to wait. No, you, here. Yeah, first.
My name is Ben Grafstrom, and I'm from University of Oslo. And I've been living before coming to Norway recently, I was living in Japan for 13 years. And I'm also not an international relations specialist, but an area studies specialist. So I was very happy to be in the same room with you today. I'm afraid that the elephant in the room is Japan's population situation. Some people call it a population crisis. Others call it simply a demographic shift. But the truth of the matter is that as your tax base is shrinking, that's citizens aged 15 to 64, you simply can't afford all these initiatives that you're talking about. As your manpower population is shrinking, you simply can't defend your maritime borders. It's simply impossible. And I would argue that Japan's population crisis is more destabilizing than anything happening in Russia or anything happening in China. Yet, you didn't mention it once today. And I feel like this is a trend that happens with foreign policy experts in Japan. They simply ignore this massive situation. So I would like to maybe hear a few words about that, if you would. Thank you.
Maybe if it's okay with you, Professor Takahara, we collect Jakub
sure,
and then Cedric
sure.
in the back. So please.
Thank you very much, Jakub Godzimirski. I'm research professor at this institute, and I have one comment to your question about the demographic situation, because demography is making an impact not only on Japan but also on China, which is also important to have in mind, that it's not only Japan that faces the demographic dilemma, but China is also about to enter this very same situation. And my comment is mostly about the issue of how to understand the utility of interdependence as a tool that may somehow soften China's or other countries' approach to international cooperation and security. We understand that there are two approaches to interdependence. The one that is highly promoted, advocated by those who support the liberal institutional approach to international relations, where increasing level of trade interaction is something that is to mitigate the possibility of conflict between countries. But there is also a realist approach to interdependence that treats interdependence as a challenge and something that needs to be dealt with in order to become less dependent on other actors. And I think that this is something that needs to be somehow understood very well, because we don't know to what extent the Chinese understanding of interdependence is moving from this liberal direction into this realist direction. And we have seen at least one example quite recently that economic interdependence was not working against the conflict, because Russia was very deeply involved in energy trade with the European Union that generated a lot of revenue and welfare to the Russian state and to the Russian population. But no matter, they decided to go to war, knowing well that economic connections with Europe will suffer heavy losses after that. So it's important to somehow make the Chinese leadership understand what the economic cost of their adventurous policy would be, because China is the country that gained the most from this liberal institutional cooperation over the past 20-25 years, and the cost would be tremendous if China does something that is going to undermine the very basic set of rules and guiding the policy in this situation.
And Cedric. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Cedric de Quinn, also a research professor here at NUPI. My question is also about interdependence. You said earlier that it's on its own, it's not sufficient to ensure peaceful relations. But I understand that China is particularly vulnerable in terms of dependence for both exports and imports and economy on being connected with the rest of the world economy. So my question is to what degree is this dependence of China on the world economy a constraint? Because you asked earlier, how far will the competition go? The competition will only increase. So my question is, to what degree is that dependence a constraint on the degree to which China can use potentially force as a way of securing or seeking power? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the great questions. Yes, population crisis is real in Japan. It's extremely serious in China because now you're very familiar with this. They're aging before they become rich. So at the moment there must be a lot of tragedies happening in many families, but we just don't hear about them because the Chinese media cannot report anything negative. Especially now that the local governments' deficits are very big. They can't even pay their own government officials. Many government officials in the localities are not getting salaries. It's bad to that extent. So now what's happening in the local governments is some local government officials have started to collect a lot of fines, penalties from citizens. Not only traffic violation, there's no violation, but the police will just get penalties, but also it's in the news. This is maybe an exceptional case, but in certain localities, they have made a rule that You have to do your bedding properly inside your home. You have to clean your dishes very cleanly, and then the government officials will break into your home and check, and if the bedding is not done well, then you're fined. That's the way they're collecting money. The situation is pretty bad. And then how can you provide social welfare in that kind of a fiscal situation? So I think you're quite right in pointing out that the Japanese will face grave difficulties, but I think we'll all be in the same boat about that. Certain people in China envisage this new Pax Sinica in the world, especially in our part of the world, but to me it looks just like only an extension of Pax Communista, that is their internal order, which is not supported by rule of law, but it's supported by the outstanding power of the Chinese Communist Party. So, you know, the international order, you know, the Chinese emphasize they want a multipolar world, yeah? But what do they mean by a multipolar world? It kind of resonates in the thinking of many people in the global south. Oh, that sounds good, you know, where Americans are not dominating the world anymore. But I warn them, you have to check what the Chinese mean by multipolarity. It doesn't, when they talk about the equal and orderly multipolar world, it doesn't mean equality between China and the smaller nations. They only talk about equality between the poles. So, you know, that's the kind of world order that is in the minds of, unfortunately, the Chinese. And yes, China economically is dependent on the world. That's why they're very serious about securing the safety of the sea lines of communication. But the problem is that they are willing to do it by themselves. So I tell my Chinese friends, I understand, we all understand the importance of sea lines of communications to you, but don't think of doing it by yourself. Even the Americans can't do it by themselves. That's why they have allies and things. But they adamantly refuse to have allies. Yeah, they cannot ally with Pakistan, or they cannot ally with North Korea and fight for them. You know, so it's difficult. Does it work as a constraint on their use of power? To some extent, I should think so. But now they are trying to build up BRICS. You know, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. What have you, because they want to secure a group of friends that they can rely on, even when they have confrontation with us.
I see we're nearing the end of our time, but I wanted to give a chance to Erik and Charlotte for some final brief comments, and then finally.
Okay, I think you brought up a very important topic at the end of your presentation regarding strategic patience and also the long-term developments and what the consequences are. Because dealing with Russia and also dealing with China now, we tend to focus on the short-term challenges and dealing with them and a hope for a brighter future. But there's very few discussions regarding how long we can tolerate this harassment of neighbors that both China and Russia are doing, and escalation risks, you know, dealing with that. So I hope that that is the topic. This long-term thinking and scenario thinking will be more predominant in both academia but also policy areas. It's very important.
And a comment to Ben about population. I agree that we're all in the same boat. Norway's in the same boat. What Japan has been focusing on recently is also automation of defense systems, alliance building, where you defend, like the US forces in Japan have now retreated back to Guam, but they will become important in bridging this gap between SDF is recruiting, has recruitment issues, and then automation systems, AI in defense. And we're also working on cyber, which Norway also has an interest in. So all of these connection points can also become areas of cooperation for European countries struggling with demographic population, as well as Japan and South Korea and China at some point.
I only have a very boring final comment to make. That is, whatever, we need to understand China very correctly, and it's not easy these days, especially now that they're detaining a lot of foreigners, including Japanese and Chinese scholars working in Japan. It's increasingly difficult to actually go and talk to people, and people inside China, it's very difficult for them to speak what's really in their minds. So in this kind of a situation, I think we have to cooperate even better amongst ourselves, exchanging, sharing notes, and discussing China. Hopefully, including a lot of Chinese living in our countries, whom we can trust. So all these efforts are needed, and I highly appreciate and thank you for having a wonderful opportunity for me to discuss China and related issues with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming and for an excellent talk and for the discussion here. Thank you for coming here today. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much.